This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Otelli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. U.S. tariffs on dozens of economies take effect, the latest chapter in President Donald Trump's efforts to reshape global trade. The American leader threatens a 100% tariff on semiconductor imports, but he says companies that are producing chips in the U.S. or are committing to do so are exempt. China's July exports top expectations. A drop in shipments headed to the U.S. is offset by goods diverted to Southeast Asia. Thailand and Cambodia agreed to allow ASEAN observers to inspect disputed border areas to ensure the ceasefire holds and prevent any breakout of violence. Ahead on East Asia tonight, South Korean capital Seoul is seen losing its shine as a magnet for the wealthy. It saw the steepest drop in a ranking of the world's 50 richest cities last year. What's driving this exodus of millionaires? The Trump administration's slew of reciprocal tariffs are now in effect for dozens of the U.S. trading partners. It comes a week after the U.S. president signed an executive order imposing duties from 15 to 41%. Well, just minutes before midnight local time, Mr. Trump posted on his Truth social account and in capital letters to say that billions of dollars are now flowing into the U.S., largely from countries that have taken advantage of America. Now, in East Asia, two of Washington's biggest Asian allies, namely Japan and South Korea, are now being charged a 15% duty on imports to America. It's 20% for Taiwan, and China's deadline to reach a tariff agreement is just a few days away. Now, Mr. Trump also threatened tariffs of about 100% on semiconductor imports.
We'll be putting a tariff on of approximately 100% on chips and semiconductors. But if you're building in the United States of America, there's no charge, even though you're building and you're not producing yet in terms of the big numbers of jobs and all of the things that you're building. If you're building, there will be no charge.
Well, Mr. Trump did not elaborate on how the duties will be implemented. Taipei says its semiconductor powerhouse, TSMC, which supplies to customers such as AI chip designer NVIDIA, is exempted because it has factories in the U.S. For more on this, we are joined now by CNA's Victoria Jen in Taipei. First up, Vic, walk us through the current status of Taiwan's negotiations with the U.S. and what are some of the sticking points?
Well, trade talks between Taiwan and the U.S. are still ongoing, but they have hit a few bumps. Earlier this year, the U.S. slapped Taiwan with 32% tariffs. Those have since been reduced to 20%, but Taiwan's hoping to push them down further to 15% on par with Japan and South Korea. But here's the problem. The U.S. isn't just talking tariffs. It's asking for more in return. Now, according to media reports, after Japan and South Korea pledged to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S., Washington is now asking Taiwan to do the same. But Taiwan is a smaller economy compared to Japan and South Korea. A massive investment package of that scale would be a hard sell back home. So this request is now one of the major sticking points in the negotiation. Politically, things are tense too. Taiwan wasn't pleased when President William Lai was recently denied a transit stop in New York, and defense talks were quietly scrapped earlier this year. Analysts say that's added pressure on Lai's government, which is already facing pushback at home over its handling of U.S. ties. But despite that, Taiwanese side still remains very cautiously optimistic. The government says talks are moving in a constructive direction, but with demands now tied to bigger investments, the stakes are clearly rising.
We're talking about this cautious optimism there, but considering Mr. Trump's latest comments on potential 100% tariffs targeting semiconductors, what is Taiwan feeling about in terms of trying to secure a favorable outcome?
Well, when Trump says he's considering a 100% tariffs on all imported semiconductors, that definitely gets Taiwan's attention, especially because chips are Taiwan's crown jewel. TSMC alone supplies over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. But here's the key point. Trump also said companies that are building chip factories in the U.S. would be exempt from the tariff. And that's where Taiwan sees a potential lifeline. TSMC has committed $165 billion in investment in Arizona. So the company is likely to be exempt. But other smaller Taiwanese semiconductor companies that don't have the capacity to build plants in the U.S. could be hit. Analysts say that that's where the concern really kicks in. Even if TSMC is safe, the rest of Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem, companies that feed into TSMC or serve other international clients, might struggle to stay competitive if they are slapped with higher tariffs.
It sounds like smaller companies will feel the pinch right there. Thanks so much, CNA's Victoria Jian in Taipei. The South Korea's trade minister says that the country will be treated as the most favored nation by the U.S. in terms of semiconductor exports. According to Seoul, this means that Korean firms will not be subject to 100% duties. Trade Minister Yo Han-koo said in an interview that regardless of how high the U.S. semiconductor tariff rate goes, South Korea will enjoy the rate set for MFNs, all thanks to the bilateral agreement between the sides. Asked whether chip manufacturers Samsung Electronics or SK Hynix will face 100% tariffs, Yo answered no. Well, investors cheering the news with both companies' stocks ending the day in positive territory in Seoul. And for more, Roland is here to break down the reaction in the markets for us. Roland?
Thanks, Otelli. Markets trading mixed as investors mull the tariffs. Now, in Japan and South Korea, markets traded in the green, shrugging off U.S. President Trump's vow to impose 100% tariffs on imports of semiconductors and chips. Japan's topics even briefly hitting an all-time high. The Nikkei 225 focusing on tech counters up 0.65%. The broader topics index up more than 0.7%. Benchmark Kospi index in Seoul nearly 1% higher and Kosdaq up 0.24%. Despite the market expecting today's news sooner or later, there is still some uncertainty lingering. According to Japan's Kyodo news agency, the White House has poured cold water over Japan's expectations by saying that Japanese imports will not be given special treatment. Now, if confirmed, this will be in very clear contrast to the Japanese government's explanation of the terms of the bilateral trade deal. The news agency reports, based on their source, that the Trump administration's 50% tariff rate for Japan will stack on top of pre-existing duty rates applied to imports. And on China, the U.S. president said that he could announce further tariffs on China, similar to the 25% duties announced earlier on India over its purchases of Russian oil. Now, when asked by journalists if this is what he's planning, Donald Trump said it, quote, could happen. Amid all the tariff upheaval in the past few months, exports from China recorded larger than expected growth in July after a rush to meet the President Trump's deadline. Manufacturers continue to take advantage of the 90-day trade truce to speed up shipments. In U.S. dollar terms, exports rose 7.2% on year, beating estimates, and that's also higher than the revised 5.9% increase in June. Imports jumped 4.1%, picking up pace from the previous month. China's trade surplus also narrowed to $98.3 billion. July is the second full month of Chinese goods benefiting from reduced U.S. tariffs following the trade truce signed in mid-May. Some analysts say that Chinese companies still remain concerned over the lack of clarity on whether Beijing can reach a trade deal with the U.S. Remember, China is facing a deadline to reach a durable tariff agreement with the U.S. next week. Checking in on the market reaction, Shanghai Composite closing out the day up 0.16%. It's a day of red for Shenzhen, down 0.18%. And Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index, well, it's up 0.7% for the day. Now, to talk more about the evolving U.S.-China trade dynamics, Otelli and I are joined by Hao Hong, who is Managing Partner, Chief Investment Officer at Lotus Asset Management. Hao Hong, good to have you on the show. As always, exports to the U.S. dropped 22% on year in July. Shipments to ASEAN, Europe, Africa, LATAM all rose sharply. How sustainable is this diversification? Is it enough to offset lost ground with the U.S. markets?
Yeah, well, I think the trade numbers are beating expectation, and people are generally surprised, because most of us are expecting a deceleration in terms of export growth, or some even expecting a decline. But I think it's because of the 90-day extension of the trade tariff negotiation, and therefore, I think the foreign demand continue to stock up in anticipation of, just in case a substantially higher tariff imposed on Chinese goods. And also geographically, the U.S. is no longer the biggest trading partner for China. It's now ranked number 3 in terms of value of trade. And also you're seeing European unions and also the ASEAN countries getting more Chinese imports these days. So the geographic mix has been shifting, and one shouldn't be too surprised to see the mix continue to shift towards Europe and also towards the ASEAN countries.
Going back to China, at the same time, China's official PMI suggesting a slowdown in manufacturing, and yet we're seeing services activities accelerating. Export numbers are up, particularly to Southeast Asia. How should we be interpreting this divergence?
Yeah, well, I would say that, the import numbers are up doesn't necessarily mean that the domestic demand is up. It's because the Chinese import is mostly service in terms of, for example, software royalties, IT services and all that. It has very little to do with stable consumptions. So I think as a result, the imports are up, I think as part of China's efforts to sort of counter the international criticism that, China is not importing enough from the international communities. So I think for China, it's also good to import, high value IT services and softwares and all that. In terms of geographically mixture, because over the past couple of years, China has been building factories in many of the Asian countries. Nowadays, many of the countries in Asia can buy very cheap and well-made Chinese EVs. So this trend is continuing. And it's very similar to Japan in the 80s and 90s, where the Japanese companies have a saturated domestic demand, and then they start to export and extend overseas. And I think China is by and large following that kind of strategy to expand overseas.
So how? Some say persistent deflation, weak private consumption, all of that still remains a real concern. So in your opinion, what sort of policies would you recommend to perhaps reignite household spending to counteract some of these deflationary pressures?
Yeah, well, we've seen some policies rolled out already. For example, now we're giving newborns 3,600 yuan a year per family for the first 3 years. And also, I think the government is going to roll out free education for preschool kids as well. And hopefully, the social security side, the government can do more for the Chinese people. All in all, we're seeing policies being rolled out to stimulate or, to sort of help consumption. But having said that, these policies are kind of long-term, and also they are small in terms of scale. For example, the newborn subsidies amounts to probably 200 billion yuan per year, which is not a very large number. And also, the 3,600 is kind of small for especially people in the tier 1 cities. So I think, in the first half of the year, the Chinese government rolled out national subsidies for electronic consumptions and also EV purchases as well. So in the first half of the year, consumption actually held up better than expected. But I think, the national subsidy is largely gone by now, largely spent. So going into the second half of the year, hopefully we're going to see some more subsidies to help Chinese households.
How the temporary tariff truce with the U.S. seems to be propping up exports ahead of its August 12th expiry date. How critical is it then for China and the U.S. to actually formalize this deal? What are the economic risks if it lapses?
Yeah, I think, the date is drawing near. I think so far we've seen basically some sort of framework being agreed upon, but then there was no final agreement. I think the talks is still ongoing, and also I think China is trying to control the pace of the negotiation by using the trump card of the monopoly on rare earth supply. So I think as a result, even though 12th of August is drawing near, and also it is possible, it's still possible to reach some sort of final agreement. But on the surface of it, now it's only like probably less than 2 weeks left. One has to sort of, be quite careful of this date in terms of, when you trade the market.
Right, and how U.S. pressure on China to halt imports of Russian Iranian oil seems like that's intensifying amid the 100% tariff threats. So how do you think energy security, geopolitical strategy, all of that is going to be factoring into China's trade policy calculus?
Yeah, I think China is one of the biggest buyer of Russian oil and also Iranian oil as well. It has been, trading with those nations for a long time now. I think, in terms of national energy sufficiency, you're seeing, this year China is actually installing more power generation from the new energy sector, for example, solar energy and also hydro electric power as well. So I think as a result, China as a country is actually rapidly electrifying, right? So the country's dependent on fossil fuel is decreasing to less than 50% now. So we're generating more power from new energy sectors, from renewable energy sectors. So I think as a result, China is more independent in terms of energy than before. But then at the same time, we still need the fossil fuels, especially cheap fossil fuels, to sustain economic growth. After all, we're talking about 130 trillion yuan GDP worth of economy, and also we're talking about 1.3 billion people living in this country. So the energy demand is just substantial. But then these days you're seeing the electrifying pace is actually quickening rather than slowing.
Well, thanks so very much for sharing some great insights there. Hao Hong, Managing Partner and CIO, Lotus Asset Management. And of course, Roland will be back with us with more business updates after this short little break that we are going on. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, Toyota's profit in June hits the brakes, and we'll tell you by how much. Also, another set of earnings, this time from SoftBank. Japanese company reporting earnings that topped expectations, driven by gains in its Vision Fund tech investment arm. The details when we return.
Welcome back to East Asia Tonight. Now for some business news. Tech giant Apple has increased its planned investment in the U.S. That comes amid pressure from President Trump to shift its supply chain to American soil. China, according to recent estimates, still accounts for 80% of Apple's production capacity.
Today, we're committing an additional $100 billion to the United States, bringing our total U.S. investment to $600 billion over the next 4 years. As a part of this, we're launching Apple's American Manufacturing Program. It will spur even more production right here in America.
Apple's so-called American Manufacturing Program brings together 10 companies across the U.S. to help produce components for Apple products, in part bringing more of Apple's supply chain and advanced manufacturing to the U.S. to avoid potential tariffs.
As part of this historic commitment, Apple will massively increase spending on its domestic supply chain for the iPhone and will build the largest and most sophisticated smart glass production line in the world.
Tony Nash of Complete Intelligence weighs in on how effective Mr. Trump's tariff campaign could be in reviving American manufacturing.
It's a really interesting approach, probably more extreme than most people would want. But I think it underscores how serious the Trump administration is to get those jobs, or at least some of those jobs in the U.S. So during the announcement, he said for companies who are committed to building in the U.S., meaning if somebody's announced the building of a factory in the U.S., there won't be tariffs on their stuff or something. There'll be something decided that will be favorable for them while their factories are being built, or for 2 years or 3 years or something like that. I don't really know. But what's really interesting is with the Apple announcement and with, say, the announcements from Japan and Korea over the last few weeks for the hundreds of billions of dollars, my thinking is that a lot of those large announcements were related to tech and factory and semiconductor infrastructure build because they probably suspected this was coming. But I don't think it can happen overnight. These things take years to build, and it's going to be a transition over 2 to 3 to 4 years. Now, what will happen in many cases is companies will try to run out the clock on the administration. This is what they did in the first Trump administration. They'll try to run out the clock on this administration as well, in terms of how quickly do they have to build, how much capital do they have to allocate, and so on. So I think the administration is going to have some quick, sharp requirements for investment so that those companies and those national interests don't run out the clock on Trump.
Toyota Motor is cutting its full-year forecast given the U.S. tariffs on imported cars. That's after it turned in its first quarter report card, which beat expectations. Operating profit for the April to June period came in at around $8 billion. That's down 10% from the close to $9 billion a year earlier. The data highlighting the pressure U.S. import tariffs are placing on Japanese automakers, even as a trade agreement between Tokyo and Washington offers potential relief. The world's biggest automaker says it expects the U.S. levies to cut its profit by 1.4 trillion yen. That's about $9.5 billion for the full year. Sony has raised its full-year operating profit forecast to more than $9 billion as it anticipates a smaller tariff impact. And that's up 4% from the previous time the company reported the forecast. The company delivered strong first quarter performance boosted by its TV and game sectors. Japanese giant reported a 2% growth in sales to nearly $18 billion compared to the previous year. Operating profit for the April to June fiscal first quarter up some 36%. A large part of that boom is thanks to a strong showing by subsidiary Sony Pictures, which posted a 76% climb in operating profit on year. The gains were also bolstered by a hike in television series output, including HBO's The Last of Us, as well as broadcast staples like Wheel of Fortune. Sony's games division also saw a doubling in profit due to higher sales of network services and games, some titles not made by the company. More to come for Sony as it's set to release its highly anticipated Grand Theft Auto 6 next year. The company also shrugging off the prospects of U.S. tariffs, forecasting a lower than an expected impact. Sony shares closing out the day 4.13% higher, and that's down from an intraday high of 5%. Another Japanese firm beating market expectations for profits in the first fiscal quarter. A SoftBank Group rebounding from a loss in the same period last year, driven by gains in its tech investment arm, the Vision Fund. The Japanese investor logged a $2.87 billion profit for the quarter ending June. That's a stark contrast with a net loss of some $1.18 billion a year ago. SoftBank's Vision Fund has been making mammoth investments in the artificial intelligence sector. It's currently leading a $40 billion funding round in ChatGPT's maker, OpenAI, in what is the largest ever private tech deal on record. The firm also made some gains from its investment in South Korean e-commerce firm Coupang, as it awaits for the finalization of a $6.5 billion takeover of AI chip firm Ampere Computing. And that'll do it for business. Ohtani.
Thanks so very much for that, Roland. Coming up next on East Asia tonight, US and South Korea set a date for their joint military drills, but delay some exercises which have been a source of tension with North Korea. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines you are following. U.S. tariffs on dozens of economies take effect, the latest chapter in President Donald Trump's efforts to reshape global trade. The American leader threatens a 100% tariff on semiconductor imports, but says companies that are producing chips in the U.S. are exempt. And China's July exports top expectations. A drop in shipments headed to the U.S. is offset by goods diverted to Southeast Asia. Thailand and Cambodia have reaffirmed their commitment to uphold the terms of a 13-point ceasefire agreement. The statements were made after top defense officials from the two nations concluded critical border talks in Kuala Lumpur. The meeting was co-chaired by Cambodia Deputy Prime Minister TSMC and Thailand's acting Defence Minister Natapon Nakpanit. Malaysian Home Minister Saifuddin Nasution, along with representatives from the US and China, also in attendance. Ahead of talks, the two neighbours accused each other of violations since the truce took effect last month. Now, both sides have now agreed to allow ASEAN to inspect the disputed borders to prevent a resumption of hostilities.
ฝ่ายไทยจะยึดมั่นในการให้ความร่วมมือและการพูดคุยอย่างสุจริตใจและจริงใจต่อไปบนพื้นฐานของการเป็นเพื่อนบ้านที่ดีและก็หวังว่าฝ่ายกัมพูชาจะปฏิบัติตามเช่นเดียวกันท้ายที่สุดแล้วไทยและกัมพูชาเป็นประเทศเพื่อนบ้านที่มีพรมแดนติดกันและย้ายหนีจากกันไม่ได้เราเป็นสมาชิกของครอบครัวอาเซียนด้วยกันหากทั้งสองประเทศสามารถแก้ไขปัญหาต่างๆได้อย่างรวดเร็วก็จะนำความสันติภาพมาสู่พื้นที่ชายแดนและประชาชนของทั้งสองประเทศก็จะได้กลับมาใช้ชีวิตเป็นปกติอย่างสงบสุขอีกครั้ง
Both sides agree to exchange information and facilitate the dignified and timely return the deceased individually at an agreed location in the full respect of humanitarian principle and jurisdiction without crossing the border. In this spirit, Cambodia hopes that Thailand will immediately release and return the 18 captured Cambodian soldiers.
For the latest, we now speak with CNA's Afifa Arifin live from KL. Afifa, first up, perhaps give us a rundown of today's meeting. What exactly was Malaysia's approach in this latest round of border talks?
Well, today marked a very meaningful step forward with Cambodia and Thailand formally endorsing a 13-point ceasefire framework, largely building on what the regional military commanders had already agreed to after the ceasefire on July 28. Now, this agreement reinforces a full freeze on troop movements. It bans reinforcements and prohibits any airspace violations or new military construction near the border. There's also a very strong humanitarian component. Both sides pledged to abide by international law on the treatment of captured soldiers and to ensure the dignified return of the deceased. Now, to prevent further escalation, a monitoring mechanism is now being activated. This includes an ASEAN observer team that's led by Malaysia, and while in the interim, ASEAN defense attaches will monitor compliance independently from both sides of the border. Now, Malaysia's Home Affairs Minister Saifuddin Nasution, who's representing the country at the talk, says the outcome reflects ASEAN's core values. Let's listen in to what he said earlier.
We are proud to see that both sides have given this commitment throughout their meeting the last few days. In ASEAN, we believe in resolving disputes through consensus, non-confrontation, and through trust, mutual respect, and the spirit of non-interference. As hosts, we are deeply honored to support both parties in this process, and we stand ready to offer any assistance needed in facilitating talks, building confidence, or supporting practical mechanisms for monitoring the ceasefire.
So what's next? Well, both sides will meet in 2 weeks and then again for another round of the General Border Committee meeting, which has to be held within a month. The location is yet to be confirmed, but Malaysia will continue to serve as a neutral coordinator, ensuring that both sides remain committed.
Also, Afifa, as the ASEAN chair, what would Malaysia's involvement look like just moving forward?
Well, we know that Malaysia is not directly involved in any talks, but as ASEAN chair, it's playing this very crucial role of a neutral convener and neutral coordinator. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim made that very clear that Cambodia and Thailand, they both want to resolve this issue bilaterally. And as such, there is no need for any full ASEAN intervention as both sides, they've also asked Malaysia to continue facilitating the process. Mr. Anwar had met both of the defense ministers from Cambodia and Thailand in Putrajaya this morning ahead of that GBC meeting. Let's listen to what he had to say about that meeting at a separate event in the morning.
Kita rasa tidak perlu lagi campur tangan ASEAN secara menyeluruh. Mereka mendukung ikhtiar ini dan memadai Malaysia dan menekankan kerjasama dua halak, Cambodia dan Thailand. Dan negara China dan Amerika tidak terlibat dari segi pengawasan sepadan. Mereka hanya menawarkan kerjasama dan bantuan logistik sekiranya perlu.
So we know that China and the US, they were present at the talks, but they participated only strictly as observers. Both also offered any sort of logistical assistance if needed, but will have no role in border monitoring or enforcement. That function remains within the ASEAN framework and is to be led by the countries directly involved and not external powers. The US ambassador to Malaysia, Edgar Kagan, was at the talks this afternoon. Let's listen into what he had to say.
We believe that what we've seen here is a sign that both governments have recommitted themselves to this, and the U.S. will be watching very closely to ensure that governments remain committed to a ceasefire. We will continue to work closely with Malaysia in its role as ASEAN chair and other ASEAN countries to try and ensure that ASEAN is able to play its part in bringing these two very important ASEAN member states together.
For Malaysia, as the ASEAN chair and the coordinator of the talks, the message is clear. This is something that's ASEAN-led and ASEAN-driven. And observers say, the outcome of today's meetings could actually offer a blueprint for resolving regional disputes without any sort of foreign intervention.
Oh, looks like it all turned out pretty well. Thanks so very much for that report. CNA's Afifa Arifin live from Kuala Lumpur. US and South Korea are set to hold major joint military drills aimed at bolstering readiness against North Korean threats. Exercise Ulchi Freedom Shield will take place from 18th of August across 11 days and will also involve thousands of troops from both sides. South Korean and US officials say this year's drill will assess an upgraded response to heightened North Korean threats.
북핵 위협을 고려하여서 그에 상응한 우리의 억제 능력을 향상시키기 위한 훈련이 진행될 것이고요.
What we also do is look at the cooperation between Russia and the DPRK from conflicts that are going on, such as Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Iran-Israel conflict. We take those lessons learned from the modern battlefield and incorporate that. So we do look at a wide range of scenarios that could impact the Korean Peninsula in a crisis or conflict.
The annual drills have been adjusted this year, with 20 out of 40 training events taking place in September instead. Officials say this due to reasons such as extreme weather, denying there are any political factors behind the move. These drills have long been a source of tension with the North. Pyongyang has previously called the exercises rehearsals for invasion, using them as a pretext to carry out military demonstrations such as weapons tests. South Korea has confirmed that it has taken a North Korean individual into custody in what's presumed to be a defection. The incident took place last week. The South Korean military spotted the individual near the north of the Han River estuary on the west of the Korean peninsula. Well, this area is regarded as a defector maritime border known as the Northern Limit Line. It's occasionally used as a route by North Korean defectors swimming to South Korea's Gangwon Island, one of the closest territories to the north. A local media reports that the individual was tied to floating plastic and waved for help. South Korea's defense ministry says the individual expressed their wish to defect when asked by an officer. Tens of thousands of North Koreans have fled to the south since the 1950s, since the peninsula was divided by war. North Korean escapees are generally handed over to Seoul's intelligence agency for screening when they arrive in the country. Last month, Seoul repatriated 6 North Koreans who requested to return home after they were rescued at sea. South Korea's Unification Ministry says the move was carried out in line with its humanitarian stance. Emergency workers in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong have been working around the clock to restore normal operations following some of its worst downpours in this century. Guangdong has been experiencing a prolonged period of heavy monsoon rains, which cumulated to reach its second heaviest August rains in this century earlier this week. The persistent downpour has triggered landslides and traffic disruptions across the province. But some relief may be in sight as forecasters are expecting rainfall to ease at the latest by Friday. Most parts of Guangdong will likely see cloudy skies and rising temperatures. However, officials have also flagged that at least 2 more typhoons are predicted to hit the region later this month. Persistent heavy rains battering parts of northwestern Japan's coast have prompted authorities to issue warnings of mudslides and flooding for residents living in low-lying areas. A record 331 millimeters of rain was dumped on Kanazawa City in Ishikawa Prefecture in a 12-hour period overnight. That's 1.5 times more than its monthly average for August. Parts of the prefectural capital have been drenched in rain since Wednesday. Roads in at least 19 locations were inundated and some houses were flooded in. Local authorities have set up evacuation centers in the city. Japan's meteorological agency has forecast heavy rain clouds forming in the adjacent Toyama prefecture as the weather system moves northeast. Heavy downpours and thunderstorms are expected through Friday, and atmospheric conditions will likely be extremely unstable across northern to western Japan. Another breaks up, but coming up on East Asia tonight, a look into one of China's first retail spaces dedicated to humanoid and consumer robots. And we'll tell you what's driving the exodus of millionaires from the South Korean capital Seoul in our CNA Plus segment next. Japan's demographic crisis is showing no signs of easing. The country's native population, according to latest data, has shrunk for the 16th straight year. A government census released yesterday showed that the number of Japanese nationals falling by more than 900,000 in 2024. Now that's a 0.75% on-year drop and the largest decline on record. The data also revealed a historic low in the number of Japanese children born and a record high in the number of deaths. Now, the census also showed a rise in the number of foreigners for the 3rd straight year. As of 1st of January this year, there are some 3.7 million foreigners in Japan, a nearly 11% on-year increase, the largest on record. The influx, however, is not quite enough for growth. The overall population, now at 124.3 million, decreased 0.44% compared to last year. Tokyo was the only prefecture where the Japanese population increased, continuing a trend from the previous year. On the other hand, the number of foreign residents in all prefectures across the country rose. Are you looking for a new chess rival, a robo-pet, or perhaps even an Albert Einstein replica humanoid as your personal tutor? Well, at newly opened robot store in Beijing, you can find all 3. Well, the shop's packed with more than 100 different robots from some 40 Chinese producers. It's among China's first retail spaces dedicated to humanoid and consumer robots. A glimpse into what could become more commonplace amid the country's push to lead the world in artificial intelligence and robotics. Our prices could range from a couple of $100s to an eye-watering hundreds of thousands of dollars.
就其实现在人形机器人的之所以价格很高，还是因为成本的问题。但是我觉得随着行业标准的逐步统一，然后呢，它的零配件供应的渠道更加丰富，而且它的生产线现在各家企业都在搭生产线，随着它的生产线订单来了之后，它可以有成本铺设生产线，它的生产线 做好之后，它的这种流程化的这流水线式的方式制作，就比它现在的方式，这成本要节约很多，价格一定会降下来。
China sees robotics as a solution to challenges that include an aging population and slowing growth. Now, this sector has been bolstered by generous subsidies exceeding $20 billion this past year. Authorities, meantime, are looking into creating a fund worth more than $130 billion to support the country's robotics and AI startups. A report shows South Korea may be losing its shine for the rich. Capital city Seoul fell the furthest in this year's Hanley and Partners Top 50 Cities for Millionaires. It dropped 5 spots to 24th place, behind Singapore, Hong Kong and Beijing. Well, this week's CNA Insight finds out why and what this means for South Korea.
"20 years ago, South Korean Ken Lee found himself in Singapore on secondment. 5 years later, he founded a business consulting firm there. Today, he's a millionaire working with some well-known brand names.
We are handling more than 1,000 over clients in Singapore, mainly Korean companies like Hyundai Motorcar, Samsung, LG, Lotte, SK, all the duty-free shops, and Paris Baguette. We do accounting and audit, tax, HR service, recruitment, all the consulting service we provide to them, especially some wealthy people who wants to relocate from Korea to Singapore.
When Ken first migrated, only a small number of high-net-worth Koreans were on the move. 2 decades later, more of the well-heeled, mostly from Seoul, are looking for a change of scenery.
Actually, I moved rich people. Rich people means a few $100 million or sometimes some $10 to $20 million people, net worth. Actually, they had an inquiry to me every year around 5. So I moved almost 50 people, rich people, to Singapore already. But nowadays, especially this year, only 6 months passed. About 10 inquiries came to us.
Seoul, South Korea's capital, is losing its status as a magnet for wealth. Last year, the megalopolis dropped from 19th to 24th place in Henley and Partners' Top 50 Cities for Millionaires list. The list ranks cities by the number of resident high-net-worth individuals, defined by the migration consultancy as those with at least $1 million in investable liquid assets. Out of the 50 cities listed, Seoul saw the sharpest decline. And in fact, before this year's list was published, the number of millionaires had begun falling 3 years ago, from 97,000 in 2022 to 82,500 in 2023, then to 66,000 in 2024. Of last year's loss of some 16,500 ultra-wealthy, around 1,200 of them migrated, while another 15,300 slipped from the millionaire status.
According to their report, Korea has ranked at 4th in the world for the number of high net worth individuals to move to other countries for citizenship. And among them, the first one is China, and then UK and India. Considering the population, except China and India, Korea is the second biggest country in the number of migrating to the other countries.
So, why have some 1,200 wealthy individuals left Seoul? For one, it could be South Korea's tax regime. The country has a progressive tax system, with the top earners taxed at a rate of 45%. It also has some of the highest inheritance tax rates in the world. Passing on assets above 3 billion won, or just over $2 million, are levied at 50%.
So tax burden is lighter, but it's still very high by global standards. So that's one reason why wealthy individuals are looking abroad. That's for protecting their assets. When they get older, they want to pass their assets to their children. You have to pay higher tax here, but if you do that in outside the country where tax rates are relatively low, it will give them incentive even after the moving cost. I think they can save a lot of money in tax.
Another push factor is pessimism over South Korea's economy. According to Hana Bank's 2025 Korean Wealth Report, 3/4 of wealthy individuals expect the economy to worsen this year.
It's not just the tax reason, but they see better opportunity outside the country. It can be not just the tax, but business-friendly environment and the growing opportunity.
Nowadays, Korea economy is a bit down. Also, particularly a bit unstable. So that's the reason why a lot of people come to here, and also me.
But why should South Korea, or any country for that matter, be concerned if the ultra-rich leave? For one, there's the risk of capital flight. South Korea's KB Financial Group defines the rich in South Korea as those with more than 1 billion won, about $700,000 in financial assets. Some 460,000 people fall into this category. It's a tiny proportion of South Korea's 51 million population, but an important one.
That's slightly less than 1% of Korean population, but they hold nearly 60% of total household financial assets. So the concentration is really high. Those super rich people are concentrated in Seoul.
예, 대한민국의 부유층들은 투자나 소비를 담당하는 아주 중요한 주체입니다. 이들이 투자와 소비를 함으로써 기업의 매출이 올라가고 또 기업의 투자가 늘어납니다. 이런 기업의 투자가 늘어나면 고용이 늘어나고 이 고용이 늘어나면 이 중산층들이 더욱더 수입이 좋아집니다. 현재 많은 부유층들이 한국을 이탈하는 것은 이러한 선순환에 악영향을 줄 것이라고 생각이 됩니다.
Additionally, the rich leaving could be a portent of dark clouds ahead for the economy.
다른 나라로 가는 것은 상당히 한국 경제에 안 좋은 신호라고 보고 있습니다. 부자들이 많이 한국을 떠난다는 것은 그 미래에 대한 한국에 대한 투자의 수익성이 떨어진다는 걸 의미합니다. 그들은 무엇이냐면 자신의 현재뿐만 아니라 미래의 자산에 대해서도 신경 쓰기 때문에 한국에 대해서 투자하는 것은 그만큼 가치가 없다는 것을 의미합니다.
Find out whether Seoul can win back its millionaires on the full episode of Insight, airing tonight, 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. Now, just before we go, Major League Baseball star Shohei Ohtani has recorded his 1,000th career hit, belting a two-run homer in an impressive two-day display. But the milestone wasn't quite enough to push his Los Angeles Dodgers past the St. Louis Cardinals, who rallied for a 5-3 victory on Wednesday. Ohtani now joins newly minted Hall of Famer Ichiro Suzuki and Hideki Matsui as the only Japanese-born players to reach this record in the major leagues. He still has a long way to go before surpassing Ichiro Suzuki's 3,089 hits. Ohtani is in his second season with the Dodgers after spending 6 years with the Los Angeles Angels. Two of his 3 most valuable player awards were won during his time with the Angels. And that's this Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Thanks for watching.